The plane hit 37,000 feet, and Kezia Odom was asleep before the seatbelt sign clicked off. That matters. Remember that. Because everything that happened in the next 4 hours began with a woman who hadn't slept more than 3 hours in 2 days, who had a window seat on row 11, and who would have slept through the whole thing if the man in 11C hadn't knocked his ginger ale into her lap. She woke up. That's where the story really starts. Kezia Odom was 29 years old. She'd grown up in Fayetteville, North Carolina, which meant she'd grown up in the shadow of Fort Bragg, and she'd enlisted at 18 the way some kids join a sports team, because it was the thing people around her did, because the structure appealed to her, because she was good at being told what to do and better at figuring out what to do when nobody was telling her anything. She did 2 tours. She came back. She didn't talk about what she'd seen, not because she was dramatic about it, but because she'd learned that most people asking didn't really want the answer. They wanted to say they'd asked. There's a difference. By 29, she was working as a logistics coordinator for a medical supply company in Atlanta. She wore blazers to work and ate lunch at her desk, and the most dangerous thing in her average Tuesday was the parking garage elevator, which she didn't fully trust. She was flying to Detroit for a work conference. She had a carry-on that weighed exactly 22 pounds because she'd waited on her bathroom scale that morning, and she had a window seat, and she had been looking forward to 4 hours of doing absolutely nothing. The ginger ale ruined that. The man in 11C, his name was Robert, he told her 3 times. The way nervous flyers repeat things, handed her a fistful of paper napkins and looked like he might cry from embarrassment. She told him it was fine. She meant it. She blotted her sleeve and looked out the window and tried to find her way back to sleep. That's when she noticed the flight attendant. Her name tag said Priya. She was young, maybe 23, and she was standing at the front of the cabin with the drink cart, and she wasn't moving. She was staring at the cockpit door. Her hand was on the cart handle, and her knuckles were white, and she was staring at that door the way you stare at something, when you already know what's behind it, and you haven't figured out yet what you're supposed to do about it. Kezia had seen that look before, not on planes, and other places, in low buildings with no windows and very poor lighting. It's the look a person gets when their mind is running ahead of their body, when they already know the shape of the problem, but their legs haven't caught up yet. She unbuckled her seatbelt. Robert in 11C said, "Oh, the light is still on, I think." Kezia stepped into the aisle. She moved to the front of the plane quietly. She was good at quietly. She touched Priya's arm, and Priya flinched like she'd forgotten there were other people on the aircraft. "What happened?" Kezia said. She didn't say it like a question. Priya looked at her. Then she looked back at the cockpit door. Then she leaned in very close and she said, so quietly that Kezia had to read the shape of the words as much as hear them, "Captain Whitfield hasn't responded in 20 minutes. I knocked. I used the intercom. I called back twice. The door is locked and I can't get. I don't have the override code and I called Marcus in first class and he's been on the phone with dispatch for 10 minutes and nobody is telling me anything clear and I don't know what to do." There are moments in a crisis where time does something strange. It doesn't slow down exactly. It sharpens. Everything that isn't the problem falls away, and what's left is just the problem and your capacity to meet it. And you either have that capacity or you don't, and you don't know which one you are until you're standing in it. Kezia said, "Is there a co-pilot?" Priya said, "Captain Whitfield and First Officer Dean. But First Officer Dean went to the laboratory 45 minutes ago and hasn't come back." Kezia looked down the aisle toward the rear of the plane. The laboratory indicator light at the back was red. "Occupied." "Did anyone check on him?" "Marcus did. He knocked. He said there was no response." She thought about this for exactly 3 seconds. "Get me the override code," she said. "For the cockpit. Someone on the ground has it. Someone in dispatch has it. Tell Marcus to stop asking and start insisting." Priya stared at her. "Who are you?" she said. "Someone who's going to need that code," Kezia said. What the other passengers knew at this point, nothing. The seatbelt sign was on because of turbulence. The drink cart had stopped moving. The 2 flight attendants near the front were having a quiet conversation. People were watching movies, and listening to podcasts and eating pretzels and doing the specific kind of nothing that humans do at 37,000 feet when they've handed the business of survival entirely to someone else. Kezia was aware of this. She was aware of the 112 people behind her who did not know that both men responsible for landing this plane were, at minimum, unreachable. And at maximum, she didn't let herself think the full version of that sentence yet. She needed more information before she got to that sentence. Priya came back in 4 minutes with a code written on the back of a cocktail napkin. Her hand was shaking. Kezia folded the napkin, put it in her blazer pocket, and said, "Before I open that door, I want you to understand something. Whatever is in there, you and I are going to handle it. We are not going to panic. We are not going to do anything that tells those 112 people back there that something is wrong. Are you with me?" Priya took a breath. She was young, and she was scared, and she was also, Kezia could see, someone who'd been trained for exactly this, and who had a core of something solid underneath the fear. She straightened her back. "I'm with you," she said. Kezia knocked on the cockpit door once, announced herself. Then she entered the code. The door opened. Captain Whitfield was in his seat. He wasn't moving. He was seated, upright, with both hands in his lap, and his eyes were partially closed, and the color of his face was wrong. It was the grayish pale of someone who was no longer engaged in the basic business of being alive, or who was very close to that border. And Kezia couldn't tell from the doorway which side of it he was on. The cockpit was in order. The instruments were active. The autopilot was engaged. She could see that. A steady indicator light on the panel. And the plane was flying itself. Had been flying itself. Which was why nobody in the cabin had felt anything unusual. Why the turbulence had been the only disruption. Why 112 people were back there eating pretzels with no idea. She moved to Captain Whitfield and checked his pulse. It was there. Weak and slow in a way that frightened her, but it was there. She said to Priya behind her, "He's alive. Call for any medical personnel on board right now. Anyone with medical training. Quietly. Do not use the intercom. Walk the cabin." Then she sat down in the co-pilot's seat. "Now, there's something you need to understand about what happened next, and it's important, so stay with me." Kezia Odom had never flown a commercial aircraft. She had never trained on one, never sat in one of these seats, never touched the kind of controls she was looking at right now. What she had done was fly, twice, in a 2-seat trainer with a friend of hers who'd washed out of flight school and moved back to Fayetteville, and who occasionally took her up on weekends because Kezia had been curious and because her friend needed an excuse to get in the air. Basic instrument reading, basic feel for pitch and yaw. Nothing that you would call training, nothing that prepared you for this. What she did have was 6 years of learning how to function under conditions that were trying to prevent her from functioning. She had the specific ability to look at a problem that was larger than her and not look away. And she had, in the slim front pocket of her carry-on bag, currently stowed in the overhead compartment above row 11, she had a notebook. It had belonged to her father. Her father had spent 31 years in the Air Force. He'd flown C-130s out of Little Rock Air Force Base. He was not a famous man. He was not a man who'd been written about or commemorated. He was a man who'd shown up, who'd done the work, who'd come home with grease on his hands, and a specific kind of quiet that Kezia had spent her whole childhood trying to understand. He'd given her the notebook 2 years before he died. It was filled with his handwriting, procedures, checklists, notes on instrument readings, diagrams of cockpit panels, observations from 30 years of flight that he'd written down. Not because anyone asked him to, but because writing things down was how he thought, and because he'd always believed, in the way that some people simply believe things without being able to explain why, that the notes might be useful to someone someday. She had the notebook because she'd been going through his things last week. She'd brought it on the trip because she hadn't been ready to leave it behind. She asked Priya to get the bag from row 11. Priya ran. While she was gone, Kezia looked at the instrument panel. She was breathing deliberately, in for 4, out for 4, the way she'd learned in places where controlled breathing was the difference between a decision and a reaction. She identified what she recognized. Altitude indicator, airspeed, heading. She found the autopilot controls. She did not touch anything yet. She watched. She listened to the sound of the plane, which was steady, which was the only good news available to her right now. Priya came back with the bag. Kezia found the notebook. Her father's handwriting was small and precise, the kind of handwriting that belongs to people who spent years filling out official forms. She turned to the section. He'd organized it by subject. She knew this. She'd looked through it before. She turned to the section he'd labeled, simply, in his practical way, Emergency Procedures. Communications. She found the radio. She had to try twice before she got the frequency right. On the second try, she heard a voice. "This is Kezia Odom. I'm a passenger on flight 1140 out of Atlanta. I'm currently in the cockpit. The captain is unconscious and the first officer is incapacitated. I need to speak to someone who can talk me through what I'm looking at. I am not a pilot. I have some basic flight experience and I have a set of notes from a 30-year Air Force pilot, and I need help right now." Static. Then, "Flight 1140, this is Detroit Center. Say again your last." She said it again. There was a pause, not long, maybe 8 seconds, long enough. Then a different voice came on, older, steadier, a voice that had, she would find out later, spent 22 years working approach control and had handled 4 in-flight emergencies, and who had, on the night shift at a facility in Michigan, looked at his screen and understood immediately what kind of call this was. His name was Douglas Ames. She didn't know that yet, she would later. He said, "I hear you. Tell me what you see." Priya had found a woman in row 23 who was a nurse practitioner. Her name was Selena. She was traveling back from her sister's wedding, still wearing the heels she'd worn to the rehearsal dinner because she'd packed her sneakers and couldn't find them at 4 in the morning. She was now kneeling beside Captain Whitfield in the cramped space behind the pilot seat, doing what she could with the plane's medical kit and her own training and the specific ferocity of a person who had decided they were going to be useful. She told Priya she thought it was a cardiac event. She couldn't be certain. She needed equipment she didn't have. She kept working anyway. The first officer, his name was Dean, James Dean, 28 years old, in only his second year flying commercially, had been found in the rear lavatory by a flight attendant named Corinne. He was conscious but couldn't stand. He had, apparently, felt ill 45 minutes earlier and made it to the lavatory and then not made it back out. Food poisoning, they would determine later. The kind that comes on fast and takes you off your feet. He wasn't dying. He was just entirely unable to fly a plane. So it was Kezia, in the seat, with the notebook, with Douglas Ames on the radio. What the passengers knew now, still very little. Priya and Corinne had, with extraordinary composure, told the cabin that the captain had experienced a medical situation and that the airline was in contact with ground control and that everything was being handled. They said it like they believed it. Maybe they did. Kezia could hear the murmur of the cabin behind the closed cockpit door. She wasn't listening to it. She was listening to Douglas. He walked her through it, calmly, specifically, without any performance of authority, the way a person talks when they understand that their only job right now is to be clear. He told her what each instrument was showing her. He told her what the autopilot was doing and why she should leave it alone for as long as possible. He told her what Detroit's weather was. He told her the runway they were going to use and why. He told her with the patience of a man who had spent 2 decades making complicated things understandable to frighten people, how to begin the process of descent. And she asked questions, good questions. Specific questions, the kind of questions her father would have asked. She recognized them as his questions, phrased in her voice. What does this needle mean if it moves left? What's the sound I'm going to hear when we change altitude? If this number starts dropping, what do I do first? Douglas answered everyone. Midway through the descent preparation, the autopilot did what it had been preventing from doing for the last 90 minutes. It gave a soft, almost gentle alarm. One tone, not urgent, just a notification. And the indicator light changed from steady to blinking. Kezia said, "The autopilot light is blinking." Douglas said, "I see that. You're going to take it off autopilot in 2 minutes. I'm going to tell you exactly when." She said, "Okay." She didn't say it like she was scared. She was, but she'd learned a long time ago that the voice you use is not the same as the feeling underneath it, and you choose one of them to be in charge. She thought about her father. She thought about him in a C-130 over places she'd never seen, filling out these notes in his small, precise handwriting, not knowing who would read them. She thought about the fact that he had known her well enough to give this particular notebook to this particular daughter. Whether he'd known it would matter, she had no way of knowing. She thought maybe he had. She thought he was someone who believed in being prepared for the things you can't predict, which was, when she thought about it, the same thing she believed. She put her hand on the controls. "I'm ready," she said. Detroit Metropolitan Airport closed runway 3L to all other traffic at 2047 in the afternoon. Emergency vehicles were positioned. 3 crash trucks, 2 ambulances, a fire unit. Standard protocol for what the tower was now logging as an in-flight emergency with civilian at controls. The tower chief that afternoon was a woman named Rhonda, and she would tell people afterward that she'd handled her share of unusual situations in 19 years, but that the voice on the radio that day, steady, specific, asking the right questions, was one of the more remarkable things she'd heard in her career. Not because it was dramatic, because it wasn't. Because the person on the other end sounded like someone doing a job, not someone having an experience. That's what people forget about courage. It's rarely loud. Flight 1140 began its descent over Lake Erie. The plane was moving. Kezia had both hands on the controls, and Douglas Ames was talking her through every degree of it. And there was a moment, somewhere around 4,000 feet, where she felt the plane respond to something she did. A small correction, a slight adjustment to keep the nose level, and it responded the way her father had always described it. Like a conversation, like something that, if you were paying attention, would tell you what it needed. She was paying attention. 3,000 feet, 2,000. The runway was visible now, a long gray strip between flat Midwestern landscape, and she had the heading and she had the airspeed, and she had the Douglas on the radio telling her she was exactly where she needed to be. 112 people in the cabin behind her did not know who was flying their plane. They would find out in about 90 seconds. She brought it down. The wheels met the runway at 3:03 p.m. on a Tuesday in November. It wasn't smooth. There was a hard kiss of rubber on asphalt, a bounce, a second contact, but it held. The plane held. The brakes engaged and the speed dropped, and Kezia held the controls steady and kept her eyes forward and let the plane run itself down the length of the runway until it stopped. Then it was quiet. Not fully quiet. Engines still running. Systems cycling down. Outside, already, she could hear the first of the emergency vehicles approaching. And the cabin behind her erupted. She hadn't expected it. She'd been so focused on the cockpit, on the instruments, on Douglas's voice that she'd almost forgotten. There were people back there. 112 of them. And they didn't know who had landed this plane, but they knew the plane had landed. And the sound they made was not polite applause or restrained relief. It was something raw and full and slightly unhinged. The sound of people who had been carrying fear they didn't fully know they were carrying and who were now putting it down. Priya opened the cockpit door. She looked at Kezia. Her eyes were bright. She said, "We're on the ground." Kezia set the notebook on the panel in front of her. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs. She took a breath. "Yes," she said, "we are." What happened after is a longer story. Captain Whitfield was taken off the plane by paramedics and transported to Henry Ford Hospital, where he underwent emergency surgery for a cardiac arrhythmia that had, according to his cardiologist, been lurking undetected for years. He survived. He was retired from commercial flight the following spring. And at his retirement party, he said, among other things, that he owed his life to a logistics coordinator from Atlanta, who had never once been in the front of a plane and who had managed, somehow, to get 114 people, counting herself and Priya, safely onto the ground. He said it without looking down. He meant every word. First Officer Dean recovered. He was back flying 3 months later. He sent Kezia a letter. It was 1 paragraph long, and the last sentence was, "I don't know how to say the right thing here, so I'll just say thank you and trust that you know what I mean." She did know. The airline, and this part matters, did not immediately understand what to do with Kezia Odom. She was not a pilot. She was not an employee. She was a passenger with a carry-on bag and a blazer and a notebook that had saved, give or take, 114 lives. The initial statement from the airline's communications team called it an extraordinary situation, resolved through the coordinated efforts of our crew and ground support, which was technically true and completely insufficient and was, quietly, pilloried by everyone who heard it. What changed it was Douglas Ames. He gave one interview. He was not a man who sought attention, and he would not give more than one. In the interview, he said, "I've talked to a lot of people through a lot of situations. This woman was different. She asked better questions than most of the trained pilots I've worked with. She never panicked. She never stopped thinking. And she had notes, a notebook her father had left her, and she used them. I don't know how else to say it. She was exactly what the situation needed." The interviewer ran everywhere. Kezia herself gave almost no interviews. She gave one to a reporter she liked because the reporter didn't ask her how she felt. She asked what she'd been thinking about during the descent, and Kezia said she'd been thinking about her father and about how he used to say that preparation was just another word for love, that you prepared because you loved the people who would be affected by your failure, that every checklist was, at its core, an act of caring. The reporter printed that. People who read it, and many people read it, said it was the sentence they remembered. What most people didn't know, because Kezia didn't discuss it, was that in the months after the flight, she went back to her father's things. She went through them more carefully this time. She found more notebooks, 7 of them, 30 years of observations, procedures, thoughts, diagrams. She found a letter he'd written to the base commander in 1996 requesting updated training materials for crew members who might encounter incapacitation scenarios. The letter had been acknowledged and filed and never acted on. There was a note in the margin in her father's handwriting added later. "Keep asking. Someone will listen eventually." She thought about that for a long time. She's still thinking about it. She still works in logistics. She still eats lunch at her desk. The most dangerous thing in her average Tuesday is the parking garage elevator, which she still doesn't fully trust. She has the notebook, all 7 notebooks now, in a fireproof box in her apartment in Atlanta, and she has a photo on her desk of her father in his flight suit, taken sometime in the late 1980s, squinting into the sun on a tarmac somewhere she doesn't know. She's not famous. She doesn't want to be. She did a thing that needed doing, and then she went back to her life. But somewhere in Michigan there's a flight controller named Douglas Ames who still thinks about the voice on the radio that afternoon, and somewhere in Detroit there's a captain who wears the scar on his chest like a reminder. And somewhere in a hospital stairwell in Fayetteville, there's a small piece of graffiti that appeared 3 weeks after the news ran. No one knows who put it there, that says simply, in black marker, "Kezia landed the plane." Her father would have been proud. More than proud. He would have recognized it. He prepared for it his whole life. Without knowing her name, would be the one at the other end of it. That's the thing about preparation. Sometimes it skips a generation. I keep coming back to the notebook. Not the landing, not the radio call, not the moment the wheels touch the runway in Detroit. Those are the parts people talk about when they tell this story. But what I can't stop thinking about is a man sitting somewhere quiet, filling pages with small, careful handwriting, not knowing who would need it or when, just knowing that someday someone would. Kezia's father didn't prepare those notebooks because he thought his daughter would end up in a cockpit at 37,000 feet. He prepared them because that's who he was. That's the thing about real character. It doesn't wait for the right moment to show up. It shows up in the ordinary moments, the Tuesday afternoons, the habit of writing things down even when no one's asking you to. What he was doing, all those years, was practicing the kind of person he wanted to be. And that practice, quiet, consistent, unglamorous, is what saved 114 lives. That's the cause. The landing was just the effect. What strikes me about Kezia is that she never pretended to know more than she did. She got on that radio and said plainly, "I am not a pilot. I need help. I have some basic experience in a set of notes and I need someone to talk me through this. That kind of honesty takes something most people underestimate. It's easy to project confidence when you have it. It's something else entirely to be clear-eyed about your limits, while simultaneously refusing to let those limits be the end of the story. She asked better questions than trained pilots. Douglas Ames said that, and I believe it, because the best questions don't come from knowing everything. They come from knowing exactly what you don't know and caring enough to close the gap. That's a kind of intelligence that can't be taught in a classroom. It gets built through years of paying attention, of taking the work seriously, of being the kind of person who, when handed a notebook by a dying father, keeps it in her carry-on instead of a drawer somewhere. And then there's what she did with her fear. She didn't eliminate it. You don't eliminate fear in a situation like that. You just decide which thing gets to be in charge, the fear or the task. She chose the task. Every time, for 4 hours, she chose the task. Every time, for 4 hours, she chose the task. That's not a personality trait you're born with. That's a muscle. She built it in places she doesn't talk about, on tours she doesn't describe, in moments that shaped her in ways most people around her will never fully understand. I think about what her father wrote in the margin of that letter. Keep asking. Someone will listen eventually. He spent 31 years doing the right thing in a system that didn't always notice. He didn't stop doing the right thing. He just kept going, kept writing, kept preparing, kept asking. And eventually, not in his lifetime, but eventually, someone did listen. Someone had to because he'd made sure the knowledge survived him. That's the longest game there is. Not the one where you win today. The one where what you build outlasts you and does good in a world you'll never see. Kezia landed the plane, but her father flew it too.